And I hope everyone can hear me online. And if you can't, I'm sure you'll let us know. So this is Indigenous Week at Western. And in a way, I find it somewhat odd that we have an Indigenous Week, given that we all need to acknowledge that we are on the territory of our Indigenous friends. And I would like to just recognize the 3 First Nations community that live alongside us, the Chippewa of the Thames First Nation, part of the Inishabi, the Oneida Nation of the Thames, part of the Haudenosaunee, and Mani Delaware Nation. I find it somewhat odd. This is before I get here, and I will get there. But one thing to know about me, if you've never heard me speak, is that I'm very proud of my Irish roots. I have an Irish mother and an English father, or I did. They've passed on now. But when I think about things like colonization or decolonization, they always I find them imprinted on my body. Because growing up in England in the 70s, as I did, it was a time when if you had Irish roots, you kept quiet. And Irish women, when they went out into the public realm, often kept quiet because their voices would give them away. Anyway, that's a little bit about my history, but today we're not talking about my history. We're talking about leadership in an age of Me Too. And I've joked to at least a couple of people in the room that you should never have an interesting title because it puts pressure on the presenter to then have an interesting presentation. So what I'll say is that I hope parts of this are interesting, informative, and more importantly, they elicit dialogue and debate. Because what is so crucial to my heart is that we come prepared to have a discussion with one another. We might not all agree, and that's totally fine, but that we have a discussion is something that I'm hoping we're going to do. So I'm going to speak for around about 25, maybe 30 minutes. And my talk's got 3 interrelated parts. So I'm going, if this works, yes, it's very odd. It kind of works differently on different screens. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Me Too movement and some of its antecedents, where it came from. And then I'm going to be talking about leadership. And no surprise to any of you who've seen me talk before, I'm going to bring in Hannah Arendt, because as someone who has spent the last decade of her life really thinking with Arendt, this presentation today is a way for me to try and connect to very perhaps disparate ways of thinking. And then I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about a project that some of us in this room are working on, a shirt project. And then we're going to have that discussion and debate that I talked about. Okay, so everybody ready? Let's get going. So first of all, I want you to think about this question. What is leadership in an age of Me Too? It seems to me that the question itself is rather over the top, right? How can we say that we're living in an age of Me Too, right? I mean, the Me Too movement, as we currently know it, most of us, has been going for around about a year or so. So it's not really the age of enlightenment that I'm talking about today, is it? And yet I think there's something really important that what I'm calling the age of Me Too can tell us about leadership. For on the one hand, when we think about leadership, we could say we don't see it, right? We don't see leadership. What we see instead is, and this is what I want to argue, a kind of irresponsibility, right? It seems to me that we're living in an age when leaders do whatever they choose, and others facilitate their whims or stand about in awe, not knowing what to do. But then there are the some, the valiant few, who do not facilitate the leader's whims, nor do they stand in awe. And these are the people that Hannah Arendt tells us are those who have the potential to engage in leadership action. And I'm going to argue that Me Too and offshoots like the Women's March are in many ways a response to the kind of narcissistic and dysfunctional great man leadership that we see on the world stage. Great women leadership too. You know, it's a kind of leadership that knows no gender in some ways, but is also in other ways very much related to a kind of toxic masculinity. So it's no surprise to me that this year the Oxford English Dictionary has picked a word to sum up the year, and that word is toxic. And when we think about it, that's pretty sad, a sad state of where we are, at least linguistically. Okay, it does get better, I promise. Okay, so perhaps we could say, though, we've been looking for leadership in all the wrong places. And maybe what we need to do, this is what I want to talk about, is to think about leadership not in the shape of a singular individual, but in the shape of a collective. So the first part of this, what I think of as this interweaving talk, which I hope is not too disparate because it's very much me thinking aloud here. In any case, the Me Too movement has really proven to be a catalyst for bringing about public awareness about sexual violence. And it has the potential to affect major societal change if leaders, right, for there are some, are willing to confront the organizational structures and individual behavior that leads to violence. But we might want to ask ourselves why it is that Me Too has been such a successful movement. How has it managed to grasp the attention of so many people worldwide? Is it because that for many, the movement is fueled by the actress Alicia Milano, however, on a different part of social media, drew the Me Too movement to our current attention? I think about the Me Too movement as very much being fueled by the activism of fourth wave feminists who, like their first wave counterparts, as well as their second wave counterparts, took to the streets to demand structural change. And across the world, we have seen much of this direct action, right? Direct action, which, and here, sorry, Gen Z, I didn't find a picture on China, but I got one on South Korea and India. But what we see is that people are collectively deriving their strength, not just from one another, but from their belief that it is time to make a change. So we see this as well. I don't know how many of you know what's going on in Spain. There's some really interesting stuff going on in Spain right now in relation to their own Me Too movement. And I really like, I don't know how many of you can see it, the image on the left, which is from the other London, which says, Me Too is not a fad. It's a revolution of truth and consequences. And we keep hearing that we live in an age of post-truth. No, we don't. We live in an age where we have to call people to account, right? And this is what these brave activists are showing us. So there are other groups that have emerged from the Me Too movement. One of which, as many of you will know, is the Time's Up movement, right? Which started a legal fund, and celebrities like Reese Witherspoon were able to raise a lot of money, 21 million. Would that we could do that in this room, right? To help survivors of sexual harassment and workplace abuse. And one thing I want to note is that when you start working in the area of gender violence, as we call it in Canada, what we find is that in different countries, they use different terms. And the terminology, when you start working in this area, can get very confusing. In the States, for instance, they like the term, many people, sexual misconduct, which is a term which is kind of difficult to get your head around because it sounds like something, to me anyway, something minor has gone on. And how can we talk about rape in that kind of terminology? Anyway, one of the things that has been great about the Time's Up movement is that 2,500 women received legal assistance, right, in, well, what is that, 4 months, which is quite amazing. And I'm sure by now those numbers have gone up. The other thing I wanted to bring up is, perhaps I should have done a separate slide, but I've got too many slides as it is. I wanted to mention Anita Hill. And Anita Hill, as many of you will know, was a woman in 1991 who went up against the judge, Clarence Thomas, in a way that we've seen very similar to what happened in the States just a few weeks ago. And Anita Hill actually came to West End maybe 3 years ago. I met her, and she is the most lovely person, really kind, thoughtful. And I think it's amazing now that she's chairing the harassment commission that's looking at the entertainment industry in Hollywood. So it's almost like things have gone full circle. Right? Sometimes, as feminists or as activists, we've just got to hang around for long enough. And sometimes, if you persist, right? This could be something that I love this. I don't know how many of you can see it. Nonetheless, she persisted. That's the kind of thing that we have to do. And it's not always easy to do, is it? All right. Because there are many other hashtag feminist groups that have emerged, such as you'll know, It's Not Okay, that started from Trump's distasteful locker room comments. And in education, we also have groups such as Me Too Academia, Me Too PhD. And in Canada, I don't know how many of you are aware, there is also an After Me Too movement. And that was started by Freya Reisenberger, and I'm not sure I'll get their names right, Aileen Chinyi, and Mia Kirshner. And interestingly enough, they're building a digital online center where they're featuring resources, right? And they're working with Barb McQuarrie from CREVAC. And I was just talking to her about that yesterday. So there's all these linkages that we're making, which is absolutely fantastic, right? There's all these different ways that we can work, each one of us, to do our little bit to try to eradicate sexual violence. The other thing I wanted to say just very briefly is that the movement, the Me Too movement, is very much involved with workers' rights too. And this is just a little bit from a letter that was sent from the Farm Workers Union in the States to the Me Too movement, right? And they say, and I don't usually read, well, I'll read it because it might be a little bit difficult to see. We write on behalf of the approximately 700,000 women who work in the agricultural fields and the packing sheds across the US. We wish we could say we're shocked to learn that this is such a pervasive problem in Hollywood, right? Sexual violence. But sadly, they say we're not surprised because it's a reality we know far too well. Countless farm worker women across our country suffer in silence because of the widespread sexual harassment and assault that they face at work. And I think it's really important that, as well as taking time to think about what's happening in places like Hollywood, that we also think about what's happening to women who feel like they can't speak out at all because they're frightened of losing their jobs or frightened of losing their lives. Okay, I'm going to turn now to, I said she'd make an appearance, to Hannah Arendt. Because I want to, and this, I said earlier, I'm really thinking aloud here, and I meant it. I'm trying to see if there's a way for me to connect Hannah Arendt's notion of leadership with various movements, like the Me Too movement, but specifically I'm going to be talking about the Women's March. And I'm going to be talking about that as an example of Orangeian leadership in action, right? So an example of what we might call post-heroic leadership, or what is starting to be called rebel leadership. I love that term, hey? If you're going to be a leader, why not be a rebel as well? Okay. So for Arendt, leadership is very different than how we normally perceive of it. In her view, leadership is about coming together of a group of people who fight for something that they believe in. It might be something that we call freedom, or she might call it treasure. And she means this not in the sense of gold coins, but in the sense of a collective longing for a world in which we value something that has meaning beyond the marketplace. So we might want to think of this leadership as perhaps a kind of fellowship, or it could be a way of affecting change, and maybe it's both. Whatever it is, though, she would tell us, we don't know ahead of time, but we know it when we see it. And I would like to suggest that this is the basis of the Me Too movement, that we know instinctively that that movement has value. And I think that's why it's been so successful, not just in North America, but around the world. And you must excuse me, I need to have some water. So for Arendt, power is not about power above, but really about, or power over, but about power with. Indeed, Arendt argues that we mistake the very notion of power when we view it in a negative light. And those of you who are inspired by the work of Michel Foucault might hear a similarity between Arendt's approach and that of Foucault's later work on power and on power relations. But interestingly enough, he was asked this in an interview, and he said, no, we're not alike at all. I think they are. And Amy Allen, for one, has written a very good book which looks at the similarities between them. But what's important for Arendt, and this is a thread that runs through her work, is that, or rather how we build relationships that sustain our world. It is, she argued, for the love of the world that we do things, that we fight against injustice, because we want to envisage something that's better than what we have, even though we might not really know what it looks like. But one of the problems, Arendt tells us, is that oftentimes, and especially in what we used to call modernity, I don't know what we call it now, post-modernity, who knows. Anyway, she says that we often muddle concepts. And one of the concepts that we muddle, according to Arendt, is power and violence. But for Arendt, whenever we see violence coming in any form onto a political arena, into any kind of form of togetherness, then we've lost power. So we've lost the way to connect with one another, which she sees as indicative of what leadership is, right? Because if we remember, leadership is a coming together over common cause, which she says again and again dissipates once violence emerges. So for Arendt then, and she says this in The Human Condition, those who espouse violence are not doing leadership, they're performing mastery. Okay, so I want to move on now to look at what I'm calling Orangeian leadership in action. And I said I was thinking aloud. I kind of made this up this morning, so we'll see if it works as a term. But what I want us to think about is the Women's March. And I'm going to tell us a little story about the Women's March, how it emerged, and whether we see it as a form of populist movement or whether we see it as rebel leadership, and can it be both and? So I'm just throwing out ideas here, some of which I hope kind of you enjoy listening to. Okay, so the seeds of the Women's March were sown when a lawyer in Hawaii, Teresa Shook, on learning of Trump's win in November 2016, wrote on her Facebook page 5 words: "I think we should march." Then she went to bed. She gets up the next morning to find 10,000 responses saying, "Yeah, we want to march." But the thing was, there was no organization, there was no leadership, there was nothing other than an idea. I think we should march, right? And so what happens, right? How do you build an organization just based on an idea like this? Well, this is what the organization did, right? But this organization was kind of, to start off with, was not a movement with leaders, but very soon became a movement with leaders. And that woman there, the second from the left, is called Bob Brown. And she was one of the early organizers, but her activism was all in the business field. And very quickly, what happened with the Women's March was you start to have a lot of contradiction, contestation, and people getting really annoyed. Why? Partly, it was because of race. People were saying there are no women of color, no Black women involved in this movement. So how can it be a women's march? So quickly, what Bob Brown did was to get 3 activists who are there with her, Tamika Mela, Carmen Perez, and Linda Sarso, to help organize the march. And in a very, very short time, I mean, if businesses could do this, they'd be really, really successful, right? Because this was a real viral organization that came from the ground up, right? Which, as I said earlier, that's what Arendt says is leadership, right? It emerges from the ground up when people come together. So 600 organizations, from tiny charities to bigger organizations like Amnesty, got involved in the march. But there were other people who, the organizers, and I think this is interesting because it helps me to understand what is happening in the States with regard to the women's movement and to votes for Trump. So there were people who'd come to the Women's March saying that they wanted to get involved. But this group of women said, no, we won't have organizations that have anything, who are anti-abortion as part of the march, right? Which of course in the States is making a huge statement. They also said to men, no, you can be part of our organization if you want to be allies, but you're not going to take over, because one of the things that they really didn't want to happen was there to be violence. And occasionally, as we've seen, you know, sometimes we get left-wing activists who get involved and we start to see violence. And so one of the things, remember this notion of an Orangeian notion of leadership, there can't be violence. So one of the things I think that is interesting also about this movement from an Orangeian perspective is that it wasn't that they were kind of lovey-dovey, everybody came together over in a consensus way. They were constantly fighting with one another, fighting in the sense of dialogue and debate, not in the sense of fisticuffs, right? But they eventually came together. It's a really wonderful example, I think, of intersectional feminist approach to a leadership problem in order to try and act against sexual violence. So what happened? Across the globe, 5 million people were part of the march. I don't know how many of you were at the London march. It was that 5 million. No, I don't think there was that many, but it was pretty cool, and I seem to remember it was pretty cold too. The largest march was in Washington, and at the time I have a really good friend who was part of that march, and she told me how many police there were, and that it was kind of scary at times, perhaps not surprisingly. But one of the things that I think is important about the march is that, and this is two Danish authors, Norholm, Justin Muir, and they say, the Women's March hit a nerve. For many, it met a deep need, right? A deep need to speak up, to act, to do something. Because sometimes what happens is we don't know what to do. And then what happens, we don't do anything at all. But the Women's March was a way for people to come together collectively. Of course, what happens, you have to keep going. You can't just go on a march, right? And sometimes that's a huge problem, right? How do you keep the momentum going? Of course, in the States, the way that they kept it going was through politics, right? And how we saw many, many more people, especially in the Democratic Party, get elected, specifically a lot more women, people of color. Okay. So I have to just show you an example of first wave feminists, because I think so often first wave feminists get a bad rap. There's this notion that they were all liberal feminists, middle class, didn't understand the world. Of course, that's not true. Like any feminist movement, it was made up of very different individuals in England, very much made up of a lot of working class women. And if you haven't seen this film, by the way, that came out 2 years ago, it's a really good film. I mean, actually, everybody looks probably a lot more attractive than they were in reality, you know, but it's interesting. Why I bring it up today is that the women's movement, and this is something that you see throughout its history, has always been divided on what to do first, right? And so within the first wave feminists, one of the things that they wanted to do, right, was to do something about violence. Really they knew that violence against women was a tremendous problem, but instead they went after the vote, because the idea was that if they got political clout, then they could do something about violence. I'm not sure that they made the right move, but that's what happened. All right. Okay. So, and why did I want to do that? Oh, yeah. The other reason was that, before I go on to him, some of these women referred to themselves as suffragettes. There was a reason for me doing that. Okay. So, men. I said at the start of this talk, it was really sad to me that there were no men in the room, because I think that it's very important that we're talking to men, women, all genders, right? We all need to come together. I truly believe that. But we have some odd things that men say, and here's someone, of course, Canadians. When I first came to Canada, my family out in Alberta always watched the show. I don't even know what it's called. Jeopardy. Is it still on? Yeah, like, so it's been on for like 100 years, right? But like, here we go, right? It's a scary time for men, right? And this is so interesting because I was at a conference where we were talking about leadership in Me Too in the States, and this was something that someone said. You know, what you women don't realize, this is a scary time for men. Well, perhaps it is, but perhaps it's about time that, you know, how can I say this? That people think from different perspectives, right? That when you only think as someone with privilege, then you don't necessarily understand what it means to be hurt, right? The terrible thing, and this has always got me about Foucault, is when he equates sexual violence and rape, and he says this somewhere, with being punched, right? And it is not the same. It really is not the same. All right. The other thing I wanted to do before going on to the third part, which is just very briefly to talk about what we're doing in our short project, is this has recently come out from Stats Canada, before and after Me Too figures, and I think it's really interesting. I couldn't get this so you could see it in a bigger way, but I can send you that graph if you want. So what we're seeing is that the Me Too movement has made a difference, right? We've got more reports to the police. Of those reports, the police tell us that 9 out of 10 are coming from women who identify as female. But the other thing that's interesting is that there's a sharp rise in reported attacks in businesses and in schools, right? And of course, we know, right, the businesses, 65% increase. That's quite incredible, isn't it? In a year, slightly over a year. Okay. So one of the things that we see as a problem, and now I'm really talking about segue, Rita. Bad segue. But some of the things that happen when organizations tend to do something that Sarah Ahmed writes about, this notion of damage control, right? Where sometimes we think about the institution more than we think about the people who are the most vulnerable. And if we think about what matters most, I would think, to an organization that is that tries to be ethical in some way, it's caring for the most vulnerable. But what we saw recently in the media reports, obviously we don't know what actually happened, but from the media reports of the abuse that was suffered by a student, was that the principal and the board chair didn't report to the police, right? Because they were thinking about the institution more than they were thinking about the victim or the survivor, whichever word we use. And what happened? They ended up having to resign because of that outrage. All right, so what does Sarah Ahmed tell us? She says, we need to speak about sexual violence. But if we speak about sexual violence as organizational culture, we threaten the organization's reputation. Those who are damaged become the ones who cause damage, and the institutional response takes a form of damage limitation. And this is something that we've seen within the university and the college sector, this notion of damage control. And much of the work that I've done before the Shirk grant was looking actually at the States and also looking at England and at the way that organizations will work to help themselves in terms of not hurting the brand of the institution rather than allowing things to be said openly. And of course, many of you will know that Sarah Ahmed had a great job. She was the chair of women's studies at the, I think it was University College London, no, Goldsmiths. And she gave up her job, she resigned because of what she said was ongoing racism and sexism, that no matter what happened, the institution kept doing the same thing. And so some of you who've read her work will know that when she was at Lancaster University, she was part of a team that came up with the diversity policies at Lancaster. But again, these diversity policies were seen as being fantastic, right? They won awards for their policies, but the actual organization didn't change. And so this is how we started to think about this kind of disconnect between policies and procedures, which really is, for me anyway, the start of our Shirk. So we currently, and I don't have that much to say about this, which is at the final part of this talk. But some of you know, I'm currently working with the project team on a Shirk grant that looks at sexual violence in higher ed in Ontario. And I have to say, one of the best things, last Friday, we got research ethics approval. Now, you have to be at Western to know that that means something. Anyway. So I want to thank everyone who's been involved in this project. Dr. Melody Vigso, Dr. Jennifer Chisholm from Lakehead, and Hayley Finn, Shannon McKechnie, and Leona Brun. And I'd also like to express a team's sincere thanks to Candice Brunette, who helped us when we had a very small research grant that helped us to build a lit review for the Shirk, and also to Barb McQuarrie of CREVAC, who shares her knowledge with us. So when Melody and I might have a kind of problem, we're not sure, we'll go to Barb, because we've never worked, neither of us have worked in this area before, right? I've worked for many years in feminist theory, but I've never worked on sexual violence. And so one doesn't necessarily know the right way of connecting with people. I hope I've said that in a nice way. Anyway, okay, so I just wanted to put there, I'm just not going to talk very much about this, but these are some of the guiding questions that we had for our research. And what we're doing with this research, what we're trying to do is look at not only the effects of these new policies that have been mandated in Ontario, but their after effects. And here you can see, those of you who know Sarah Ahmed's work will know how she's very much interested in embodiment, right? And how people who work with sexual violence policies, where things get stuck, right, within an institution. And also dealing with work, we're not looking at connecting with survivors, we're really more interested in the institutional perspectives. And so we're interested in the embodied experiences of people who day by day deal with this work in universities. And we know right now we're in a real crisis, right? The university for some time, not just at Western, but in other places, is in a crisis with not just sexual violence, but with mental health. So what I wanted to say about our project is, in brief, so we're examining the implementation of sexual violence policies in Ontario and the gap between politics and practice. And although many Canadian post-secondary institutions have or are developing standalone sexual violence policies, what we know is that students report many difficulties in navigating institutional procedures. And so this is the kind of thing we're interested in finding out. Where do things get stuck? And as part of our work, we're also trying to look at whether new policies are are leading to more inclusive practices. Because one of the things that you will know if you look at media reports of sexual violence is mostly what is highlighted are white women's experiences. And this is something that we want to look at to see why it is that in some ways we don't see diversity. So what else did I want to say? I've nearly finished. So what we're trying to do then is to see whether or not these policies lead to a change in institutional culture, and how can they lead to a change in institutional culture? Well, we could say that for a change to happen, senior leaders not only need to show their support, you know, we often hear about presidential task forces, right? But they have to be fully engaged in efforts, because if it's only lip service, then chances are institutions are not going to change, right? So we're really interested in understanding the very complex issues and the challenges that many institutions face in trying to translate these policies into practices. So just very briefly, for those who are interested, what we're planning to do next year is to interview various stakeholders. We're looking at specifically 2 universities, and also do some ethnographic work, participate in particular meetings to try and get a better sense of how institutions are putting policies into practice. And something that Melody and Shannon are taking the lead on, that I just want to mention briefly, is that what they're doing, and it's really interesting, and it relates back to digital activism, is looking at the emergence of Me Too PhD and Me Too academia, right? And how they've given rise to stories of sexual violence in universities across Twitter. So these are some of the things that we're trying to do. And our aim is to kind of juxtapose the findings from the Twitter narratives along with the analysis of the policy texts and also the interviews to see what we find out. I mean, we know what we think that we're trying to do, but whether that's what we end up doing, of course, in any good practice, it's always very different. And as Donna Haraway says, you have to stay with the trouble. And we have had much trouble in our group so far, doing things like figuring out what methodology shall we use. And we've had 6 months of thinking about that. And this is good. This is good feminist practice, right? As we discuss together collectively what we're doing. Okay, I wanted to end with, it seems like a Sarah Ahmed day, but I wanted to end us with this quote. And Ahmed says, "Solidarity does not assume that our struggles are the same struggles, or that our pain is the same pain, or that our hope is for the same future. Solidarity involves commitment and work, as well as the recognition that even if we do not have the same feelings, or the same lives, or the same bodies, we do live on common ground." A sentiment with which I think Hannah Arendt would concur. So thanks for listening. That's me done. Oh, and I talked too long. Sorry, I went on a bit. Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Just because it's most recent, your first research question
Mm-hmm.
is the embodied experiences
Yeah.
of practitioners.
Yeah.
So the embodiment piece I get for victims, for survivors, but tell me about that. Why is that really important for the practitioners, for the people who are, because presumably they're the ones providing the service, is what you're saying, right? They're providing whatever the policy
Right.
that they have to do, but they're, in this instance, not particularly a survivor, and they could be also.
Mm-hmm.
But what's the embodiment piece there mean? Why is that important?
Oh, I think it's very important, and it actually goes back to Ahmed's work with diversity practitioners, where she would find that the people who were really at the front of trying to make a change in the university system come up against all kinds of institutional barriers. And so there is a huge issue with taking on, the emotional labor that these people have to take on. And primarily, these people are women, right? And so it's an ongoing emotional labor that women do in higher ed and in other organizations too. So that's the kind of thing that we're interested in. We're not just interested in what they do. I mean, that really could take half an hour conversation, but we're interested in what we're calling the after effects.
So thanks, Rita. That was really great. It's just so wonderful to hear about the work that my colleagues are doing. You never know. You sit in all these other kinds of meetings and you never actually find out what's the interesting things they're doing. So now I found out. So thank you. I have two broad points. I wish I was. You seem more optimistic than I am about the impact of the Me Too movement.
Yeah.
And I don't share that optimism. I would like to. I just feel it's been decades and literally decades and decades of us knowing about sexual violence and harassment in the workplace and elsewhere, and very little being done.
Yeah.
And I think about what's happened with the Occupy movement and the critiques of the Occupy movement.
Yeah.
And so, as wonderful as it sounds to have a movement that may be characterized as being rebel leadership, its leadership is dispersed amongst many people. I actually question whether that movement as a whole can translate into really effective practices to address gender violence in the workplace and other places. And so while there's statistics that show there's an increase in people reporting, what is much more important is whether or not there are charges and convictions. And
Absolutely.
we know from so much research, especially in Canada, the recent Global Mail expose of police, we know that most of those reports do not get followed up and there's no charges. And so to me, that means nothing. The fact that there's more, it's just the same old, same old.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't really have a question here.
No.
But I am concerned that we think that it's enough to marching and these solidarity initiatives are really important, don't get me wrong, but to translate that into real effective political change, that's a whole other piece. So that's my one set of comments. I don't know if you want to respond to that before I...
Yeah, I would, because it's interesting, because the same thing has been I've been involved in a discussion with a friend from England about the same thing, where I got very excited about the Brexit march, where there were, I can't remember, 500,000 people in London. And she said, yeah, but what next? And I guess what next is kind of, I mean, I hear you, but I think that's why I work with Arendt and not Foucault. Because frankly, I need to have that optimism. I need it, and that's a bit trite. But I absolutely hear what you're saying. But I do think that there is something happening from the social movements that we're seeing through hashtag feminism. But whether it leads to lasting change, I don't know.
Time will tell.
Time will tell.
I'll hold my other comment so somebody else can speak if they wish. Monopolize the floor.
Well, I'm just wondering, when we're talking about the different kinds of leadership, like the parental form of leadership, we're talking about this building, and we see this building where, we're just coming together with this common purpose. But to what extent, alongside of when we're building anything, especially, this movement of the different form of leadership, to what extent does there need to be actual steps to dismantle the old established way? And the question's out there, how do we see that dismantling? Because people see dismantling as a negative thing.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're safe. Anyway, yes, at the same time as talking about dismantling of the emergency alert, but I'm just wondering, is it that things don't succeed because there aren't the two processes happening, and it needs to be a dismantling, not in a negative way, but in a kind of a positive way, that this is better. And so I don't know, I'm just throwing this out and thinking about how this well, because are we going to see, and my other point is, I wonder to what extent, now that we have the hockey players, Cecil, he's coming out, and I think suddenly it's maybe diffusing, not so much a gender as people think, like you talked about, that mastery, that dominance. And so I wonder what effect that might have when men join the Me Too movement as survivors as well, and not both the perpetrators. Let's see what that is. But I just wonder what is the dynamic between new kinds of leadership coming in and old kinds of leaderships not going down, maybe evolving or being mixing.
Some need to go, though. Maybe it's not about keeping them, actually.
Yeah, at the beginning of Rita's talk, when you said that sometimes people do what they want to further their own ends, and other people facilitate that because it's familiar. So some things need to go. How do we prevent that as being seen as a loss? Because part of change is where they resist the loss. So.
Yeah, that's a good point. Sorry.
Can I say something?
No.
I think I just want to respond to Marianne's sort of position around this cynicism, and I think there's an importance to make distinctions between what a movement can do and understanding the research. And so the research for me isn't to suggest that this is a movement with the answer, but it certainly is an expression of a sociological issue that's manifesting in the time in which I'm doing research. And so it's become a site of investigation, right? And so I wouldn't step forward to say Me Too's our answer, like this has provided us with the way forward. And I don't think probably, well, it's not an organized movement, so certainly there wasn't a desire to lead something through that. But I think it provides a really interesting context to understand social problems and how else do we research them, except in historians who disagree, but how else do we research them in as they're unfolding in front of us? And so this is the kind of time to be able to ask the questions around what's happening, and hopefully so that they can formulate some responses for us going forward. But I wouldn't suggest that Me Too is the answer to that, and I don't approach the research from that position to say it is. It is the response, but it is an expression of something people are experiencing, and this is and interestingly, in many different ways, and this one emerged in social media. It was a social media. It's a different platform. It's a different social space, right? And so there's, it's. That's what it is, and I'm not optimistic that this will solve the problem. Not at all. I'm probably somewhere between you two. I'm biblical, but to what we can do for that.
My added concern or worry is, and this isn't a critique of your particular research project, but policy work in general. We put so much focus on the policies themselves, and I sort of have this I've come to this conclusion based on the violence in my kids' school, that there's just a failure of policies. There could be policies that, we have great policies at this university, and I'm a law for rep. You don't know the number of people that come to my office, and it's not just around gender violence, but various issues to do with harassment and equity, and they're afraid to do anything.
Yeah.
So the policy looks great on paper, but the reality is that they don't even get to the place where that policy can be enacted because there's a fear. And I'm guessing that you're not able to talk to either victims of harassment here at the university, and how would you ever be able to recruit people who are even too afraid to come forward because they wouldn't dare speak in a research setting. And that might be, maybe you can talk about this, like one of the reasons why those aren't participants in your study. But to me, the policies, it's almost as if we don't talk about that piece of fear on the ground, then it doesn't matter what the policies say.
Yeah. I mean, if I can kind of speak to, funnily enough, Marianne, I started off with my this kind of story about I don't know how Melody ever got me involved in policy, because for much of my life I made policies in different places, and then I watched leaders just completely ignore them when it showed. So for me, policy is a very frustrating place to be. But I think in terms of Me Too movement, I don't see Me Too movement or the Women's March as important in themselves, but I think they're instances of feminism reemerging. And as a feminist, that's what's interesting to me. And people being maybe not as frightened to use the F word, right? Because we go through cycles like this where many young women just don't use it because they're frightened. And I spent a lot of time in first year classes, intro class to women's studies, where people have told me why they don't call themselves a feminist. So that's what excites me, I guess. But I'd love to hear from some of the younger women in the room. Like, what does it mean to you, this kind of stuff that we're doing? Not to put anybody on the spot.
I don't know what you mean by young, but.
Younger than me. Okay, from anyone who hasn't spoken yet.
I'm particularly excited about Me Too movement and the types of resistance it's showing by young women and diverse women. I also don't know if it's the answer, but I'm particularly excited about the type of resistance out of it. 2,500 women are able to access a fund for legal aid that they weren't able to prior to the movement. I think that is absolutely practical, real, tangible, on the ground change that we're seeing. I don't know if it's like nationwide policy discourse change, but I think there's quite clearly some affect coming from that movement. I'm excited about it. I think that you sort of have to be.
I guess I would add that I'm excited about that, but I think I'm more excited about the kind of conversation that arises from it, especially with my many male friends that I've acquired in philosophy. It's such a stark difference, and they challenge me in ways that, of course, I could get offended, but I'm just more happy that they're asking these questions as to how can we trust her, how what is truth and what is consent and all of these things. I think that's questions that we've never thought about or talked about previously. So it's empowering.
I've been listening to your answers, asking questions.
I try not to be friends who don't listen to what I'm
Yeah.
So, Dr. Rita, I have to be honest now.
research question because I also work on policy and I have some common question like yours, and I'm thinking about the sensitivity of your policy issue, sexual violence.
Yeah.
And the good news I hear from you that you get ethic approval. That's a great news. So I think, given the context of Me Too, the question you raised is really important to know about the experience of leader, challenge, and the what they get offering when they enact this policy. So if you can figure out the finding, this research is really significant in this context.
Thank you, Anne. And anytime I'd love to hear about your research.
Oh, really?
Yeah, absolutely,
You know what?
absolutely.
Because, my policy in some way is sensitivity, like your research. It's
Right.
about a policy issue.
Right,
So sometimes it's very difficult to ask people about the answers, right?
right,
So,
right. Yeah, and that's where the framing of the question is so important, isn't it?
yeah.
It's like having good research questions is key. And I spent a year when I was a PhD student working on research questions, which some of you will think is weird, but it paid off because when it came to having conversations with people, they knew what it was that I was trying to ask. All right, well, I guess it's anything online. If not, oh, thank you. So much for me speaking for 25 minutes. Sorry about that.
Thank you.
Pleasure. No. Right. Yeah.